I'm Natalie Fenton, and I'm the chair of the Media Reform Coalition, the organisation that's hosting this debate today. And I also work at Goldsmiths, University of London. The Media Reform Coalition is a group that brings together dozens of other civil society organisations, media practitioners, academics and researchers to develop policies and campaign for media reform, in light of the fact that we've got a communications environment that is dominated by a few very large, very powerful multinational media corporations and is characterised by insufficient plurality, diversity and accountability. Every year, the Media Reform Coalition puts on a fantastic debate called the Media Democracy Festival, which is a whole day of discussion around all of the issues related to media and democracy. But of course, we had to cancel that. So we're now doing a series of online debates, and this is the first of these. And we are looking here at zombie economics post-COVID-19 and the media. I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers who'll speak each for about 5 to 6 minutes. In the order that I'm going to introduce them in a moment, then we'll all come together at the end for a discussion. If you want to ask a question in that discussion, please add that to the comment stream. And if we have time, we'll pick up as many of those as we can. So over to the speakers that I'm going to introduce. They are Grace Blakeley, who is a writer, economist and broadcaster. Her book, Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization, analysed the rise and fall of finance-led growth and how we might move towards a new economic model. It's a great book. I would recommend it all to you. Then we will have Noni Makuyana, who is a facilitator, organizer and artist. She's the founder of another great group, Decolonising Economics, and works with Campaign Bootcamp, Stir to Action and Fearless Futures. And finally, we'll bring in Mike Berry, who works at Cardiff University in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture. His work focuses on the reporting of the economy and how the mass media affects public knowledge and understanding of social and economic issues. Again, some really great research to draw on there. After the financial crash in 2008, the mainstream media stood accused of ignoring the experts, of letting the banks off the hook and legitimising an austerity economic policy. So in this debate, we'll be considering what will happen post-COVID-19, when we face an economic crisis of an unprecedented scale. Has the media finally learnt its lesson? There's no doubt that the COVID-19 is a global disaster and it's having a devastating impact everywhere, but undoubtedly it will have a more severe impact in poorer nations and on poorer people in richer nations who have fewer economic and health resources to call upon. Most economies have simply stopped functioning. Millions are unemployed, and that has hit the most precarious on short-term contracts and zero-hour contracts the hardest. Treasury departments, central banks in wealthier economies are all scrambling to try and keep capitalism afloat, to boost benefit schemes, to maintain capital flowing through their economies by borrowing or inventing huge quantities of capital at levels they previously said were impossible. Debts, personal, corporate, public, are skyrocketing, and restarting the economy as quickly as possible seems to be the driver behind all the UK's government decisions right now. So the big question is whether this worldwide event will lead to new economic paradigm shifts and the sort of thinking that will be necessary to build back better. As the whole idea of what our economy should be for has come back into political contention, the government has also got very twitchy. So we've seen leaks that are already reviving the idea that this enormous bill that's being created will have to be paid for by cuts to services and a public sector pay freeze. So that dominant logic of free markets, privatization, austerity has certainly not disappeared, but they have been exposed for what they are. Suddenly, magic money trees are sprouting up everywhere. Private care homes have shown to be a disaster, and inequality and racism proven to be a matter of life or death. So in these circumstances, what schools, what alternative schools of economic thought might take their place? And how do we bring those into the mainstream? Can we take this shocking and extraordinary moment to reimagine what an economy is for and what we want it to provide? And what can we expect from the media in that process? So, Grace, a very warm welcome to you. I'm going to hand over now for your contribution.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And thanks everyone for tuning in. It's great to be able to, oh, I'm hearing a bit of feedback there. Is that, okay, that's better. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's great to be able to participate in the Media Democracy Festival, which I was really looking forward to. So it's good that it's still going ahead. Yeah, so our theme today is obviously, as we've just been hearing from Natalie, zombie economics post COVID-19 and media. I'm going to speak a little bit about the kind of zombie economics element of this and bring in the media's role in I suppose, legitimizing that a bit later. So the zombie element of this, I want people to understand, you know, this idea of zombie capitalism. We've been living in this phase of zombie capitalism for a while now. There are a lot of ways of interpreting it, but one big reason for it is debt. So especially the idea of kind of walking dead firms or institutions. These are firms that maybe should have collapsed because their business models aren't sustainable, because they are, as I said, over indebted, because their general approach to the environment isn't sustainable perhaps, but they're still going for a variety of reasons, not least including very, very low interest rates and extremely loose monetary policy. Now, what does this mean? Effectively, ever since the financial crisis, and actually arguably since before then, since maybe the kind of dot-com bubble of the 2000s, governments have been intervening in financial markets through monetary policy to make money, and particularly debt, very cheap, but crucially, predominantly for institutions that already have means. So debt has become very cheap for big firms, you know, big financial institutions, and less to an extent mortgage holders, and less so the rest of the public that are still kind of often reliant on credit cards, which charge exorbitant rates of interest. So it's important to kind of remember that disparity in how debt, you know, relates to different parts of the economy. But, you know, this idea of the zombie corporation has become really, really significant, particularly since the financial crisis, because we've had such low interest rates and such loose monetary policy. So we've had this policy of quantitative easing, which has been the creation of new money in order to buy certain assets. So historically, that's been long-term government debt that central banks have been buying. And what that's done is that the people who used to hold that debt, they've then got this money and they've been encouraged to go out and buy other assets. So sometimes that's, you know, stocks, sometimes it's housing, which is when what's kept housing prices up. And sometimes it's corporate debt, which obviously is not just lent by banks, but also you can fund corporate lending on financial markets. So what we've seen is corporate bond yields going down. Basically, that means that it's become very, very cheap for a lot of corporations to borrow money, again, linked to that trend in interest rates. And particularly, it's been very cheap for quite risky corporations that you would have expected to have faced quite high rates of borrowing to borrow lots and lots of money. And even before the pandemic, what we were seeing was effectively a big increase in, well, basically the kind of inflation of what many people were calling a corporate debt bubble in financial markets. And so, you know, in the US and the UK in particular, you saw very high rates of corporate debt, often amongst firms that were quite risky. And there were a lot of people looking at this and saying, right, well, as soon as a crisis comes, a lot of these firms are going to go under. What's been fascinating about this crisis is, of course, you know, many of those firms have maybe enough reserves to last them a month, 2 months, whatever. And the slowdown in economic activity and the lockdown to, you know, completely overwhelmed them, especially when they were getting calls. Then when they had certain payment schedules that they had to repay their debts. But now we've seen the government step in again. So after the financial crisis, stepped in to make debt very, very, very cheap, so that all of these firms, even the ones that weren't doing anything good and weren't even particularly efficient, could survive. And now we're seeing this happening again, except not only huge amounts more cheap lending being provided directly from the government along with grants, but also the potential that we might start to see bailouts down the line. A lot of firms that have received government lending, it doesn't look likely that they're going to be sustainable over the long term. It's piling new debt onto old debt. So So we face the potential that the government could actually do what it did to the banks and bail these corporations out by taking a stake in them. Then we have a very interesting and different situation. And this has already kind of been touched on by a lot of people on the left at the moment who are thinking, right, well, the state's doing lots of stuff. So what does that mean for the arguments that we've been making about austerity? We were saying the state isn't doing enough, make it do more. I think what this exposes is actually the kind of weakness of that critique in the first place, because it wasn't simply the fact that we needed the state to do more, because the state often does a lot. It just does things to protect the interests of the elite, right? And in doing so, it is supported by the media. You can think of the establishment as kind of coalescing around a lot of these policy ideas that effectively make capitalism function, and that benefit the interests of elites. So the reason states have suddenly started doing all these massive bailouts, and the media has gotten on board with that, isn't because everyone suddenly realized, oh, austerity was wrong. It's because at this particular point in time, those bailouts are necessary to keep capitalism functioning. We don't know what's going to happen when they're no longer necessary to keep capitalism functioning. Although that's a big question, because some of these institutions are so weak that these measures could be necessary for quite a long time. So then we have a question not just of like, what is the state doing and is the state doing enough, but to whom is the state accountable? And again, this comes back to this question of kind of of the ruling classes, basically. In Marxist theory, Rudolf Hilferding, who was a Marxist economist, came up with this theory that at a certain point in the development of capitalism, the interests of big businesses, big financial institutions, government, and the kind of ruling class in general become so merged and concentrated that we would be able to speak of a kind of general cartel, which is basically these kind of sets of institutions that engage in the planning of economic activity. And we're seeing this again with, times of crises are times when monopolies do well and smaller businesses tend to collapse. And we're seeing that definitely with the big tech companies. So, this question of accountability and democracy is really, really important, both when we're talking about firms and when we're talking about the state. And I'll just very quickly end by saying that this also extends to an international level. Because yes, states in the global north are all doing these big bailouts, but a lot of states in the global south are facing exactly the same, in fact, much more severe problems, but they don't have the capacity to affect these big bailouts, partly because many of them were very heavily indebted before the crisis hit, and partly because we've seen a massive outflow of money from global south to global north since it began. And a lot of these countries are now struggling to finance their debts. And again, this question of democracy is really important because a lot of these are, democratically elected governments. They are facing a pandemic, and effectively, bondholders, unelected, wealthy institutions and individuals are saying to them, you can or you can't have this, the money that you need to be able to provide your population with the relief that they need in the pandemic. Now, that issue of democracy and how far democracy goes in a globalized and internationalized economy like ours is really, really important. We need to be thinking very carefully and very clearly about democratizing our own economies, also building new international institutions at the global level that reflect the principles of democracy as well, rather than what we have now, which is a set of institutions that work on the basis of $1, one vote, and can therefore effectively be used as agents of American imperialism. So how do we hold the state to account? How do we hold these big businesses to account? How do we build new democratic institutions at the global level? Well, certainly the media is not going to do it for us. That function of the media that is supposed to be to hold, the powerful to account is certainly not, especially what we've seen from the British media as this crisis has developed. Instead, they've very much been part of this cartel, thinking about, right, how can we save capitalism? And in fact, the opposition hasn't been doing that much of a great job, I would argue, at holding the government to account on a lot of these issues either. So we really need to make sure that, and again, this links to, I think, what's going on in the States at the moment, that we are taking power ourselves, basically, demonstrating that we will not tolerate governments bailing out, fossil fuel companies, airlines, and then leaving the rest of the population to starve or become homeless or whatever because they can't afford to pay their bills. So the only way that we're really going to be able to get that measure of democracy and accountability we need is by organizing. and organising throughout society. So within political institutions, perhaps within the Labour Party to push for policies there, as well as within social movements and community organisations that exist in wider society. I guess we can talk a little bit more about that in the questions, because I'm aware that I'm going over time. But yeah, I want to make sure we're able to focus on how we can take some of these ideas forward as well, because it's not enough just to know what's going on. We have to figure out what we can do about it. Oh, over to Noni. I was supposed to say at the end. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
Hey everyone. It's so exciting to be here. And it's really weird because I've actually been avoiding doing talks and stuff. So it's really bizarre to just be on the internet at home with lots of people looking at me. So hey, welcome to my home. So just a bit about myself. So I do a lot. I'm an organizer at Decolonizing Economics. And just the whole topic of zombie economics actually is just pretty exciting, because for a really long time, we've been like, there's a history and like of a legacy of Black resistance around violence, state violence, and around just state not being very useful to people and being really harmful to people. So, and actually a lot of the work that I do is about Black death. So talking about zombie economics is actually really exciting for me, because I feel like in the society we live in, death is not considered enough, or it's not felt enough, or it's not seen as, yeah, like certain deaths are not seen as mattering and certain deaths are allowed. And that is, in its core, a mechanism of capitalism and white supremacy. And at Decolonizing Economics, we think, so one of the best quotes that I've ever heard is by the poet Suhaima Khan, also known as the Brown Hijabi. And she says, to decolonize is to contextualize. And at Decolonizing Economics, a lot of what we do is to contextualize how the economy works, because a lot of the times the stories we get told about the economy are actually just false. And those stories have really harmful effects in terms of how we can actually imagine like just economic futures. So one thing that I wanted to start off with is I approach my work from a place of expansiveness and from a place of possibility. And actually a lot of the, like for me in the last couple of years, my work has been divesting from stories of white supremacy and the structures of white supremacy, and actually turning my gaze to the wonder that is like Black resistance, and the wonder that is like the solutions and like the innovation that exists within Black economies. And when I think about like the word crisis, I also think about how lots of communities have lived in crisis for years. Like crisis is a state of being for so many communities. And what I've really found frustrating with the whole COVID crisis is that this is not an isolated crisis in some people's lives. And again, the stories of white supremacy tell us that this is like this new crisis, and whoa, it's really like scary, but I suppose it is scary, but also some people live lives in crisis. And one of the biggest, when I'm doing talks, I think about just how many people died during slavery. Like, I think, I don't have the exact number, but so many people died, so many Black people died during slavery that it changed the makeup of the atmosphere. And that is genocide. And when we think about that, like, we're also able to see how for the UK to become a major imperial power, it is directly as a result of Black death and the system relying on Black death. And like, fast forward now, who do we have dying as a result of COVID the most? Is Black communities who are frontline workers, who are like living in not great living situations. And that is a design of the economy. And a lot of the time I get really frustrated in new economic spaces, because we always talk about like the solution as like this new thing that is going to come from somewhere, but actually it's not. It's real. It's actually dependent on looking at crisis and like looking at death, and that as a continuity of white supremacy and capitalism. And one of my favorite writers and like thinkers is Achille Mbembe, and he talks about like necropolitics, which is that the state power decides who dies and who doesn't die, and that is through passive and active mechanisms. So that might look like the police shooting people and killing people, and that is like an active thing that the state does, but then also it can look like passive ways in refusing to give like nurses or like Black nurses, like protective gear to work in wards. And it might look like the food injustice that so many Black people experience. And what I wanted to say in relation to how we're thinking about like this post-COVID or like in the media is we need to move past the place of having to debate whether like death is like integral to the economy. We need to move past talking about whether like structural racism exists and how much the like, you know, because that is an obvious fact. And that is a lived fact for so many people. And I think because of the way that white supremacy works is that we get told stories that divert our attention from the actual core systematic roots of the things that we face today. And even like, yeah, and just thinking about what can we do when we go from a place of contextualizing this crisis as a result of many crises that have come before. And I honestly feel like, and like when I was talking about like coming from a space of possibility comes from a place when we are able to name the beast as it is, and we're able to actually think strategically and also give up our own investments in a structure that is actually dependent on like the subjugation of Black and brown bodies. And so I'm going to flip over the next page, so I can remember the next thing that I wanted to say. And for me, in the last 2 years, I've been working on kind of mapping the new economic solutions that exist within the Black community. So going to speak to grassroots groups and going and like learning from those people about the ways that they're working. And I really think that we need to make the move to divest. And by divesting, we're investing in groups who had the solutions because they've lived in crisis again and again and again. And to actually stop looking at these top-down structures, which have obviously been designed to not care about people and to not put the well-being of people first, but instead to commodify people's lives and to commodify people's times. And when we divest and we're looking at people who are actually like doing the work to nourish Black communities. So last year I did research on food injustice in the UK. So, and like the solutions that were existing in the UK from Black communities. And in that time, I met so many great groups that are doing the work that we seem to forget exists, instead looking for these structures to come and give us these, like, I don't know, to make change. But like Land in Our Names, who do amazing work of like reconnecting land, because land is a system of white supremacy and capitalism, and who has it and who doesn't have it is inherently political. And like they are doing the work of connecting people, like Black people, to land, so that Black people, like, because we are landless people. And like even thinking about like I worked with the 4Cs, which is like a refugee asylum seekers rights group, and what they do is they support refugees to grow food. So because food insecurity is a really huge factor that refugees and asylum seekers face in the UK when you can't work, so you're actually designated to starve. So as a result of that research, I made a zine called Black Hunger to actually, like, so many things, like hunger is a system of white supremacy and capitalism. And unless that we actually look at those key mechanisms, then we're not able to like tackle the issue at hand. So I think what is really needed by like the media and by us, or like, yeah, by the media and by lots of like the NGO sector and lots of change making spaces, to divest and move away from describing these structures, but actually to invest in communities who are doing these work and have the innovation and have the solutions. And we actually need to move from a place of like, move from the, what's it called, the mainstream to the margins, because the margins have lived through crisis and they know what crisis is. And one of the things that I actually really wanted to plug at the moment is that because of a lot of like, with the Black Lives Matter protests, we actually need to also look at how lots of these systems exist in the UK, which is the imperial center, like, of everything. And one thing that is really happening, and I really welcome you all to think about, is to redistribute your wealth, income, land, and property to groups who are doing this new economic work. So at the moment, there's a couple of fundraisers that I think we should all look at. So there's the Resourcing Racial Justice fundraiser, which is building capacity and like redistributing funds to Black communities in the UK, and UK Black Lives Matter has also set up a fundraiser as well. And there's the Majonzi Fund, which is being set up to help bury the people who are dying from COVID-19, and also the Cutie Pot Hardship Fund, which is helping Black queer people of color during the crisis. And also, I just want to say one last thing, which is like the UK is not innocent. We need to remember the people who have died, like Mark Duggan, Ricky Bishop, Jimmy Mubenga, Belly. There's so many people, and we also in the UK need to also divest from our own how we benefit from a system of white supremacy, and actually look about how we can move our power and wealth towards the communities who are doing the work and have been doing the work. There is a legacy of resistance, and it only takes people like redistributing their power, wealth, and access to actually make these things happen. So that's me. Black Lives Matter, and we shouldn't even be having to have this discussion. And also, I forgot one more thing. The media puts this thing of like having to justify why people should live or shouldn't live. And I personally do not trust in an institution that relies on debating whose life matters and whose life doesn't, because that shouldn't be a debate. So I'm going to pass over to Mark. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Mike, sorry.
That's okay. Good afternoon. I want to talk today a little bit about some of the research I conducted in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the implications of that for economic reporting and policy making once the pandemic is over. So when in 2009 the public deficit spiked as Britain entered an exceptionally deep recession driven by the banking crisis, the collapse of the property marketing, and the tightening of household credit, all media outlets told a pretty similar story, whether they were tabloid or broadsheet, broadcast or print. This was that the deficit represented a major financial crisis that needed to be dealt with very quickly. So you found apocalyptic warnings, which were often accompanied by false accounts of Britain's fiscal status. So, for instance, the Daily Mail featured an article claiming that our debt burden was worse than Greece or Italy and stood at more than 200% of GDP. The public were also told that unless Britain cut its deficit quickly, it'll lose its AAA credit rating, interest rates would rise, sterling would fall, Britain would be abandoned by its international creditors, the IMF might have to be called, and that we might even go bankrupt. Right? Now, the BBC featured these warnings, which were sometimes directly endorsed by journalists. This meant the differences between broadcast and the press were largely a question of tone rather than substance. And the research literature is pretty clear that consonant messages across different media can be very powerful. It should also be stressed at the time that there were lots of economists, including some fairly mainstream ones, who thought the deficit didn't represent an economic emergency, that the UK government would have no trouble selling its debt, and that a sovereign default by the UK, the prospects of that were almost non-existent. The crucial point here is that such views were almost completely non-existent in either the print or the broadcast media, which provided a very misleading and unbalanced picture of Britain's fiscal position. Now, when it came to how we should respond to the rise in Britain's debt, television and print media were unanimous. You have to slash the state and raise regressive forms of taxation, such as VAT. Alternatives such as taxing the better off or instituting pro-growth policies, things like the Green New Deal, which were being pushed at the time by people like Anne Pettifor and Larry Ellett. These were almost completely invisible in the mainstream media, aside from the occasional article in The Guardian. Now, when we come to how this crisis was actually understood by audiences, it was clear that the message that the rise in the deficit had created an economic emergency were widely believed by audiences. This came through both in polling at the time and also in my focus groups that I ran. Most people ascribed the rise in the deficit not to the recession and the contraction of credit issuance, but to historical labour overspending. And when asked which bits of labour overspending, people didn't point to big ticket items which had seen big real terms increases, such as health, education and transport. Instead, they pointed to issues with high sustained negative media visibility. Some of these would have been expected, such as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the banking crisis, but people much more frequently pointed to issues like immigration, welfare, public sector pensions, waste and contributions to the EU, all of which had no impact on the deficit. Two obvious conclusions can be drawn from this. Public understanding of the constituent elements of the public spending pie is extremely limited and badly misinformed. And second, people will substantially overestimate the contribution from items which have high sustained negative media visibility. And this has a huge impact on the ability to have a rational debate on public spending priorities, and it also skews public policy discussion. It's also clear that not only did the media have set the agenda for how people understood the deficit, they also strongly influenced how people thought about responses. So while most people accepted the need to slash public spending, almost no one in my focus groups talked about introducing wealth or transaction taxes or investing in green technologies. If they're not discussed in the mainstream media, they don't filter down to public consciousness and understanding. Okay, so while it's important to kind of, it's good that people are developing alternative media, we still can't overlook the importance of the mainstream media as the kind of key information source for most people. So what's the relevance of this to COVID-19? Well, most obviously, we're going to see a sharp rise in the deficit and public debt. And there's going to be a controversial debate about how we manage that. The same arguments about the dangers of debt and deficits will be wheeled out by fiscal hawks in the coming months. The aftermath of the coronavirus crisis is also going to be set against the background of an economic picture that shows the same fragilities in the economy that were present in 2008, except in even more developed form because they were never addressed. So here I'm talking about an economy heavily dependent on household debt, the property market, and the financial sector as unstable motors of growth. Low levels of investment and extraordinary levels of regional economic polarization. And of course, we also have the background of an accelerating climate emergency. So I'm going to close my talk, and I hope I'm going to keep within the 6 minutes, by saying that we need to demand much, much more of our public service broadcasters in how they cover the economic aftermath of COVID-19. There's a lot to say about this, but because time is short, I'm going to highlight 3 key issues. First of all, we need to have a much broader debate about debt, which focuses much more on the implications of household and corporate debt and its impacts, and less alarmist reporting about state debt. Journalists also should challenge false statements from politicians, such as the idea that government spending is analogous to a household budget, or the argument that governments can't spend money they don't have. These things aren't true, and it's the responsibility of journalists to challenge, particularly public service journalists, to challenge these kind of misleading statements. Secondly, I think it's important that broadcasters aim to provide proper context around public spending, indicating the relevant constituent size of the different parts of the public spending pie. At the moment, this is a black hole of public understanding, which hinders a rational debate around spending priorities. And finally, we need to have a much wider debate around the implications of a rise in the public debt and deficits and the range of policy making that is available. In particular, it ought to be discussed much more within the context of the different inequalities within the country. I'm talking here about particularly regional economic inequalities, but also inequalities relating to things such as housing, relating to things such as wealth, relating to things such as gender and also age. But also it needs to be talked, the discussion of economic policy needs to be much more grounded within the contours of the climate emergency, which at the moment it just isn't. Okay, I will finish up now and pass back over to Natalie.
Thank you very much to everybody for those fantastic contributions. We've covered such an enormous amount of ground and huge numbers of questions have come in. I'm going to try and pull some of those together, leading off maybe from where Mike finished with talking about the media. You know, Grace said that the state has been forced into playing an interventionist role in national life, coordinating bailouts, presiding over lockdowns. And also, of course, we've got that whole propaganda and public relations exercise that is ongoing with the government that is very tightly tied in to lots of our mainstream media. A lot of the mainstream newspapers in particular lobbied very hard for a government intervention to prevent them going into economic meltdown during the lockdown. And that's resulted in a £35 million bailout to those organisations in the form of advertising and paid for content that has a very particular role to play when those newspapers are supposed to be holding power to account. It's particularly ironic, of course, when they're the very papers that have campaigned really hard against any form of government regulation, calling that state intrusion in their practices. And they are still some of the papers that are paying out millions of pounds in settling phone hacking claims. So ultimately, that taxpayer money of the 35 million subsidy is going to contribute towards those settling of those phone hacking claims. Add to this, we've also got a government which is refusing to go on the Radio 4 Today programme or send ministers or representatives, that are freezing out certain journalists from asking questions in their press briefings in order to kind of discredit critical reporting. So we've got a kind of almost Trumpian response happening at the same time in a way of kind of punishing, freezing out watchdog journalism and also then feeding it cash to support certain initiatives. So in light of that, and this has come through in some of the questions, how feasible is it that any of those media outlets, and I'm including the BBC in that, will go against the government hell-bent on privatisation and deregulation? Who wants to tackle it first? And this is also, of course, this is a media that is also very happy to trot out a racist discourse that comes out of the mouth of our Prime Minister.
I don't mind taking that.
Go on, Grace.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I mean, I think it comes back to the issue I kind of mentioned at the end of my talk, which was this idea that we need to organise and mobilise if we're going to see any change in our media institutions and in society more generally. There are specific ways, as you just noted, in which basically corruption and venality kind of come to penetrate the British media, and which specific interests come to be aligned with those of the ruling classes. But I think there's also a more general point that most of the cultural media, social, political institutions that we have in society do tend to reflect just structurally the economic interests that, the power relations that exist in the society in which they're rooted. So, even if you did have greater, say, transparency in the media, you would inevitably have powerful interests working together to promote the interests of the powerful. That is, how the status quo reproduces itself. So how capitalism reproduces itself. So I think, the best way to try and push back against that is to organize against it, because the only power capable of resisting the coordinated power of the ruling classes is the coordinated power of working people who have this deep and strong incentive to see the system transformed and changed. So when it comes to the issue of media, I think, as workers and as consumers, working people have potentially a role to play there in organising and in making their concerns about this known. Now, I know that over the course of this crisis, we've seen several newspapers in particular saying, "Oh, we're facing really deep distress, and we need people to go out and buy newspapers." There's a real space there for campaigning and organising to pressure those institutions that are already pressured by economic conditions into covering issues differently, into holding the government to account better. And also, I think, and this is perhaps what is going to be the most fruitful way of making sure that these ideas are expressed, is to do what I know, Noni, for example, from my involvement in the New Economic Organisers Network, media training for progressive, that actually gets different kinds of voices out in the media, and also starting progressive media organizations that can do this work themselves and that can actually themselves hold the mainstream media to account. So I think we really have to look at this from the perspective of organizing and building power rather than just kind of small tweaks that are going to make things that are going to kind of, transform the way our media infrastructure works. Those technocratic policy changes are important, but the only way we're going to see them is if we actually build power from the ground up.
What you were saying, Noni, do you want to carry in?
Yeah. So short answer, I don't see why, I just don't see reform as being possible in changing any of the things because they just don't work, and it just doesn't work. And I also feel like, especially in the UK at the moment, the corruption, and I really liked that, Grace, you brought that word into this, because there's so much corruption that is existent within the British political sphere or whatever, and it's hideous. And I think it's really interesting how lots of, and especially if you're thinking about it with a global South perspective, just how much corruption in other countries has been blown up, especially in the global South, has been used to undermine and used to just be racist to the global South. And when you see that corruption happening in the UK, and then it's being labeled as different things and it's being understood as different things, and that's directly to do with the media. And the media creates these false dichotomies of what's right and what's wrong, and who's this and who's that, and who's an enemy and who's not. And lots of those things are stories that are just inherently untrue and inherently harmful. And so for me, I don't think that reform is possible. And I actually goes back again to divesting. And I think about Gaudem, and I've worked a bit with Gaudem, and just have realized with the care and attention that they put into their work, and their work as being sacred, and the people who they work with as being sacred. And then I think about it as well as other the POC organizers that I know who go on the BBC, and they'll be made to argue whether Black people deserve rights, or being made to argue whether trans people deserve rights. And it's painful, and no one should have to do that, and no one should have to go and do that work of reminding people that people matter. So I think what is more important is actually us focusing on supporting and redistributing a lot of the power that is existent in the media today to help these smaller grassroots publications, zines. Zines are such a powerful tool in organizing. For people who don't know who zines are, it's radical magazines being made by grassroots groups. And also I think at the moment social media and how young Black people are organizing is news enough for me. I don't really read the news that much because it's evil, and I actually look more at what the young people who I know who are actually impacted by these things are saying, and listening to them, and trying to find ways of collaborating and supporting them instead of reading stories that are just so far from the truth of what is happening, and point and paint really confusing and really distressing stories of what's happening. So I think that we should actually be investing in people like Gaudem, or people like Daikon, which is another zine, and just radical press is what we should be investing in.
Thank you. And that's a really vitally important point, I think. So back to you, Mike, really, is the mainstream media are part of the system. Are they part of the problem? You're saying we've got to look at public service broadcasting and make sure that's doing the job it's supposed to be doing, but they're just as entangled with elite power as the mainstream press are, or so it's argued. Is that the answer?
It's slightly different, I think. I mean, first of all, I want to come back to your point, which I thought was quite interesting, where you talked about, the newspapers who spent decades telling us how great the free market is. And of course, as soon as there's a big problem, they've got their hands out for a bailout. And it struck me how similar that was to the banks in 2008, who had spent such a lot of time lobbying for the removal of all regulation and arguing for that. And of course, as soon as there's a crisis, that they've all got their hands out too. And of course, they were very successful in getting bailouts and managing to keep things running exactly as the same. Now, I think it's slightly different when we come to public service broadcasting. And although I do think, alternative media is very important, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that most people still rely on on mainstream media to get their news, and it's still by far the most accessed and most important source of information in society. All of the research shows this, so we can't ignore that. I mean, and although I say, you know, alternative media is great, we should all be kind of investing in it and pushing it, we also do have to think about mainstream media, and obviously the one that's most important is the BBC, because of the fact we have some purchase on there. It doesn't matter whether we think the reporting in News International is terrible. There's nothing we can do about that. But the BBC, because it is a public body, we do have the possibility of actually putting pressure and attempting to change things. Now, the way I think that the BBC reproduces a relatively neoliberal version of economics is a variety of different reasons. It's not so much that necessarily there's a single editorial line that's laid down as you might find in a lot of newspapers. It comes more to do with a set of assumptions that are held by journalists and the kind of sources that exist. So you do get, as Grace says, you do kind of get the reproduction of the structural picture of the British economy with, you know, the large finance sector kind of talked about and having a key role in kind of setting the terms of debate on economic policy making. You can clearly see this in the kind of sources that, you know, the BBC gets on to talk about things. So when the Economist talked about it, it's amazing how much kind of economists from the city are brought on, and they're treated as impartial experts, and how rarely their views are kind of contested by what we might kind of think of as left of centre or even Keynesian economists a lot of the time. And obviously things like the Green New Deal, which in 2008 were all kind of completely excluded from debate on most of the mass audience bulletins on the news. Those things should be having a much greater role in being kind of discussed as potential policies in the aftermath of the crisis. So with something like the BBC, it's also about kind of, I think when you look at the kind of people who are employed, who have been employed as their economics editors, it's also through their kind of schooling in terms of a lot of the time neoclassical economics. A number of kind of economics editors at the BBC came through the IFS, and they kind of internalized the kind of view about the importance of balanced budgets and the dislike of deficits. So they represented kind of what we might kind of think of as a particular aspect of economic policy making, and there has been an absence of alternative views, and often even an absence, particularly after 2008, of kind of relatively mainstream Keynesian thinking.
I'm not sure that I agree that there's nothing we can do about the mainstream press. We could stop reading it and buying it. That might, you know, that's the one thing that we can do in terms of actually divestment of that nature. But I also think that without the groundswell of social movements and the real sense of public protest and then they won't change. There'll be no reason for those to change in any way, shape or form. So one doesn't go without the other. I'm not entirely sure that, you know, we can kind of crack that. But I have a question here that relates to that from Maris Peter Levix, who says, how do we build consensus for life after the pandemic? And I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of the time when we're talking about an alternative economics and growing grassroots counter narratives and alternative economies, it's very much in contention. Is there a role for trying to build consensus around this? And how would that happen if we are left with the media or working with the media that we currently have? Yeah, do we want consensus? Go, Grace.
So I think consensus is interesting because we are kind of taught to believe that consensus, that, you know, agreement amongst people is a very good thing, and it's kind of very central to particularly kind of liberal political theory, which says that if everyone just comes together, has a long discussion, they'll be able to work out, you know, what the problems are, and they'll be able to solve them by talking to each other and reach a consensus. What that perspective fails to account for is the fact that there are people who benefit from the system being the way it is. There is no capacity to reach a consensus between people whose lives are dependent upon the system being transformed and people whose interests are dependent upon the system remaining as it is. Now, that isn't to say that consensus isn't important, because building a consensus within movements that are oriented towards transformation is really important, and the way that we talk to each other, the way, you know, that we interact with each other, the way that we listen to each other is really, really important, and building consensus there by, you know, bringing people together who come from very different perspectives, with an understanding that we are all largely working towards the same goal, which is a fundamental and deep uprooting of these systems of oppression that affect us all. But there is no point in trying to, you know, bring together a CEO and like people who are disbenefiting from their actions, whether that's, you know, people who are suffering from climate crisis in the global south, or workers who are being exploited, or whatever, and saying, put them in a room, work your differences out, and everything will be fine, because that's just not going to happen. You know, some people want things to change, some people want things to stay the same. And I think providing a voice for people in the category who are seeking to kind of affect deep social transformation is really important, because basically the media is the voice of the status quo. Broadly, it's the voice of people who want things to stay the same, and occasionally small things have to change in order for things to stay the same. So media might say, oh, we need to have this change in public policy basically in order to sustain capitalism, but there will never be that attention to the kind of structural issues that really need to be transformed, and actually basically to the fact that the only way things are ever going to change is if we start centering the voices of working people in these debates rather than just an elite. So I think having a space for those voices is really important. I think that we can exercise consensus when actually often consensus is imposed on people from above by the powerful.
Thank you very much. Any final comments, people? Because I'm very conscious. Noni, I can see. Please come in.
So actually, I really agree with you, Grace, as well. Like, I think, yeah, consensus gets fetishized so much, but it's actually sometimes used to just like continue the interests of the powerful. And I also think sometimes, like, what is consensus? Like, consensus actually for lots of people means agreeing with the status quo, as Grace said. And like, there's an inherent culture of disbelief for people who talk outside of the status quo. And like, how are we ever going to get to a place of consensus? Because I think, yeah, consensus suggests that people are on some form of level equal, like there's a place of equity there. But then a lot of the time when we're talking about consensus, it's actually from a place of, it's not equity, it's just listening. But then listening doesn't mean people do stuff. And a lot of the time, I think that actually has to do with how because I feel like there's so many white people that just want to do good, and like there's a lot of like that intention, but when we end up with that consensus, it's just the idea that because I'm listening to you, you must also feel thankful and feel grateful and feel like amazed that I'm doing this work for you. But that's not consensus. That's like, I don't know, like I feel like for consensus to happen, there needs to be an inherent like work done by people who are in ruling classes to actually work on themselves and to better understand how to deal with like criticism and challenge. But then also that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing anything. You should also be redistributing your power and wealth and access as someone who does benefit from it. So I think sometimes consensus is fetishized, and I think sometimes consensus ends up being used to move along discomfort that people feel about being spaces of privilege as well.
Have the last word.
You can have the last word, Mike. Make it a good one.
Thank you. There's a couple of things I'd say about this. I mean, when we think about consensus, what I'll be thinking about is how do we create broad support for a whole series of kind of progressive things that we want to enact. The first thing I think is important to think about, two things I'd suggest. First thing is we need to think about where people actually are. Okay, so we need to think about what is the level of public understanding of particular issues. And I think you've got to be careful sometimes, particularly as academics or as people, who might be disparately described as the liberal elite. You have to be careful about the fact not to assume that the way you think about the world is the way other people think about the world. And you have to work on the basis of where the population is if you want to kind of take them with you. And there's a wide variety and levels of understanding about all of these issues around the economy and what's possible. And the second thing is I think we need to kind of focus on what are effectively common collective problems. Okay, now we obviously need to kind of deal with problems of people who are right down at the bottom in the bottom 10 or 20%. But that's got to be kind of one of our primary focuses. But we also need to speak about problems that everybody faces. Everybody faces problems relating to climate change. Everybody faces problems about a degraded public realm. Everybody faces a problem about a transport system that's falling apart and, you know, high levels of pollution. So we have to kind of focus as well and speak to people about the problems that everybody is facing in their own lives, and kind of attempt to kind of make people understand that the kind of struggle that we're pursuing and the things that we're pursuing relate to everybody, because the kind of inequalities that are being created by kind of globalized financial capitalism aren't only, you know, affecting people in the bottom 10-20% of the population. Those insecurities are affecting, you know, the great bulk of the population. I mean, when you hear that 30, 40, 50% of the population in places like the United Kingdom and the US are one paycheck away from penury and destitution, you know, that gives you a very powerful account of why we need to have a kind of social and an economic and a social welfare system that much more heavily prioritizes the public good. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think on that idea of whose consensus is it anyway, and, you know, kind of destabilizing powers and elites is a very good place to end when we're talking about media and the economy. A huge thanks to our panelists today. I thought they were fantastic and brought some really great debate to the table that is really vital that we're all having now. I particularly want to endorse that idea of organizing and getting out there and doing the politics that are necessary to make these shifts and working within communities to do that. So to Grace, to Noni and to Mike, thank you very much for being part of this really important conversation, I think. Our next online debate looks at the critical issue of media, race and religion, as we struggle to come to terms with the disproportionate number of Black and minority ethnic people who have died from COVID-19 in the UK, and of course, the brutal murder of George Floyd in the US, and as Noni rightly pointed out, very many other Black people in the UK. So please join us for that discussion on June the 11th at 1 o'clock. More details are on our website at mediareform.org. And finally, I do have to point out that the Media Reform Coalition is one of those voluntary organisations that survives mostly on thin air and some very kind donations. For these debates, we'd like to acknowledge the support of the Media, Communication and Cultural Studies Association, MEXA, and also Goldsmiths Media and Communications Department. If you'd like to support the work that we do, then please do click on the links on the closing slide or go to our website. Every donation is very gratefully received and very well used. Thank you all, and I hope to see you again next week on June the 11th at 1 o'clock. Goodbye and stay well.